மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.
In this chapter, I will continue examining the exchange Kann, and I'm going to be presenting my main suggestion and my main weapon over the past recent years that I've used against this opening. Now, in the previous section, we discussed the possibility of playing G6 and then playing Bishop to F5, which is a viable plan. But the plan that I favor more and have had really great success with is this move, Queen to C7. Now, as I've explained in the introduction, the idea of this sort of weird-looking queen move is to cut across White's plans and prevent his bishop from coming out to F4. And left undisturbed, I will simply continue my development, usually with knight F6, bishop G4, but sometimes we may even play G6 and bishop F5. We will get to these details as we wade through the variations. What I would like to start with is by showing the main line, what is considered the most popular option here. And not only is this considered the most popular option, it has also been the most popular options in my practice. And that has been the move knight to E2, which is logically preparing to play bishop to F4 and gain a tempo against this queen on C7. Now black is well advised to play bishop G4, creating this pin. And the idea is if white plays bishop f4, which is a very rare move, I've only faced this once in all of my games in this variation, now black is able to simply capture this bishop, and after knight takes f4, bishop d1, king d1, e6, the position is around equal, maybe even black is for preference because black has more opportunities to generate play. For example, down the line, the center can start advancing, or black can even start some minority attack, potentially at some point. Mostly, I'm just a big fan of black's center here. The next couple of moves can be bishop e7 and knight e7, or knight f6, knight d7. But this is a very rare line that, as I mentioned, I've only come across once ever. Most players do not do this, but instead play the move f3, which sort of logically breaks this pin on the e2 knight and gears to play bishop f4. Now, a move that I've surprisingly faced quite often here is h3, and I believe this move is a mistake, and in 2 of my games, I have managed to catch my opponents in a trap, and it's kind of a funny trap, and the ratings of my opponents were actually 21 and 2200, so expert and a master level player fell for this. And the trap here is simply, I'm going to play bishop takes e2, giving up this bishop for the knight, and now, in 2 of my games, white played this move, queen takes e2, very naturally developing this queen, but it turns out this queen on c7 is actually plotting some sinister activity due to this pin on the c-file, and that's the move knight takes d4. And like I said, I managed to do this twice, and just snag a pawn on move 8, and, well, white really doesn't have any compensation here. If he captures, of course, queen c1 is going to be instant knockout, and otherwise black can just retreat the knight after, for example, queen d1, and continue with knight e6 and bishop d6, and it's just a healthy extra pawn. So in this position, I've also faced bishop takes e2, and but in this case, white is sort of playing quite strangely. First he goes bishop d2, then he goes back bishop d3 rather, then bishop e2, wasting a lot of time in the opening. And black can just play normally with e6 and bishop d6, for example, knight f6, and so forth. So this is h3 move is nothing to be afraid of, and in fact I welcome it because most of the time players are unaware of this tactic down the c-file. Instead, f3 is a more pressing option, and the move that I face the most. Now bishop d7 is my preferred choice. The idea is, alright, this bishop has been kicked away, but we've sort of given white this free move, but the point is this pawn on f3 is really not adoring white's position in any means, because now there's a whole slew of dark squares that are much weaker, and this king is very likely going to the king side and may prove to be quite weak. Now, of course, white understands this, so he goes bishop f4, following with his plan. Now, a very important move for black, otherwise this setup doesn't make any sense, is the move pawn to e5, striking in the center and freeing up the king side. And after pawn takes e5, knight takes e5, this position has been discussed in the introduction. I'm a big fan of black's chances here. I really, and the statistics support this in my games and in practice. I believe black scores close to 60% in many of their variations here, which is a very high percentage considering that black on average only scores, I believe, 46%. And in my own games, I actually have 100% score in this variation. It's in truth, in these games I've played against players who are lower rated than me, but these players have been experts and masters for ranging from 2000 to 2200, and so decent players, not bad by any means, but they have not proven to been able to handle this position quite well. So as I already mentioned, this position I really like for black because this pawn on f3 is just so problematic with these dark squares just being so vulnerable. And on top of that, this pawn on d5 is an isolated pawn, and white hopes to exploit this pawn somehow, but in truth, it's really difficult to put any pressure on this pawn. Usually this would be done, for example, by knight c3, which of course is impossible here. So, in essence, the position black reaches here is white's goal of pressuring this pawn is not even existent. So, I'd like to show you how the game may play out from here using two excerpts, two examples from games that I've played. And I'd like to show you some typical ideas. In all honesty, there's not a lot of theory to remember here. In fact, I've never really studied the theory per se here. I've just looked at some top-level games, and over the years playing this variation, I've sort of got a feel for where the pieces should go. So let's start with looking at one of these games. In this game, my opponent played the move bishop c2, which has a certain amount of logic to it. This bishop may reroute to b3 to add some pressure to the d5 pawn, and also the queen gets to exert pressure on the d file, of course against the d pawn as well, and the bishop also gets out of some tactics involving knight takes d3. So now I played the move knight f6 in this game. We will see, as I will show in the second game, sometimes this knight has a choice in many variations of going to either f6 or e7. I will get into a little bit of the pros and cons of both of these squares in a moment. But for now, we can just look at this game where I played the move knight f6, defending the pawn. Now white played the move knight to d4, which is, okay, has some logic to it as well. White occupies the outpost in front of the d-pawn. So far playing decent looking moves. Bishop d6, now this is often the correct square, almost always the correct square for this bishop. First of all, it breaks the pin, supports our powerful knight in the center, and also prepares potentially some tactics on this diagonal, as we will see in this game. Now, castles was played, so unfortunately I don't have any discoveries like knight f3, because after queen takes, this bishop will be protected, so I simply castle. And in a lot of situations against white's tries, this is a very logical and easy way to play for black. Simply bishop d6, knight f6, get the king castled, enjoy the central presence, and then try to make progress either by swinging both rooks to the center or potentially starting some ambitious play on the queen side, whether it is via knight c4, angling to soften up the pawns, or get to e3. So, very easy development for black. Like I said, I'm not really a fan at all of white's position here, although objectively, this variation should be around equal. It seems like in practice, it's much easier for black's activity to pay off than for white's and any of white's structural goals. So, now white plays knight d2, and as I mentioned, it looks like all of white's moves are natural, decent developing moves. But in fact, in this position already, it turns out that white is in big trouble, especially after black's next move. Now, I've already stressed that this pawn on f3 is it's a huge achievement for black to have white weaken his position in this way, as the dark squares are problematic. And now, one really nice way to highlight that, and what I played in this game, is the move knight to h5, simply targeting this bishop on f4. Now, after knight h5, white faces an extremely unpleasant choice. He has to deal with the threat to the bishop. Now, in the game, white played bishop to e3, trying to hold on to this bishop, which is understandable, because if white plays bishop takes e5, then after bishop takes e5, he straightened off a very important piece. This bishop on e5 is now monster, has no opponent, already h2 is hanging, and black can simply get on with developing his pieces. Again, rooks to the center, and enjoy the bishop pair, where black's position is extremely favorable here. Another option is, of course, to play bishop to g3. Again, after knight g3, hg, black has the two bishops. White's dark squares are looking very weak. Even a simple move like rook e8 should be very sufficient to just a huge advantage here. The move that was played in the game was ambitious, bishop e3. Ambitious in the sense that white doesn't want to concede this bishop. But unfortunately for him, this move walks right into a tactic. Now in the game, I played the simple move knight c4, which targets the bishop on e3. And when white played knight c4, I played bishop h2. And after this continuation, I was simply up a pawn, and this king was in trouble as knight g3 is already a threat. So a simple way to grab a pawn. But one really cool idea that I failed to spot here was actually even stronger. The move knight to g4, this temporary pseudo-sacrifice, opening up this battery against the king. And the whole idea is, well, of course it's a double attack. So if white takes the knight, then bishop takes h2, and the tactics here are completely overwhelming white. For instance, after king h1, knight to g3 check, king h2, knight f1 double check, white is really in trouble, losing all his material here. So he would be actually forced to play king f2, but after queen g3, king e2, for example, rook ae8, this king is not surviving with such immense pressure from black's pieces. So that would have been a very fine way to win the game. I did end up winning after the more calm move knight c4, however. So yeah, this short excerpt is, in my opinion, quite instructive. Here, again, we just saw white play natural moves, and again, I'd like for you to pay attention to this simple setup that black is employing here, putting the bishop on d6, bolstering the knight on e5, castling short, nothing to really fret about here, and now just preparing to bring the rooks to the center. Already, I think black has a better position here. Now, let's look at another excerpt I had prepared. As we mentioned, in this position here, I was talking about the possibilities of this knight going to either f6 or e7. So I'd like to address that now. Now, as we've seen, knight f6 is an extremely logical development, aiming to defend the center, and even gave us a tactical shot involving the move knight h5. However, there are some benefits of playing knight e7. For example, in this game that I played as well, my opponent played castles as opposed to bishop c2 that we saw in the last game. And after castles, I played bishop d6, and again my opponent played bishop c2, similar to the last game. And I must admit that this is the plan that I've faced quite often, retreating this bishop, opening up the queen, as I mentioned. And here, I could play the move knight f6, which would be a transposition to the game we just looked at. But in this game, I made the choice to play knight e7. And this is actually a purely stylistic choice. I must admit that I think my gut feeling is that knight f6 is a superior move, just playing knight f6 and castling, and then bringing the rooks to the center. But knight e7 is more adventurous, and here's what I mean by that. When I put my knight in e7, I actually am aiming to play queenside castling, as opposed to short castling. And the whole point of the knight on e7 is that I want to actually play f6 to support my knight on e5, and then play this aggressive thrust g5, and then h5, and then possibly g4. So the knight on e7 has some benefits here. And as I mentioned, it's kind of a stylistic choice. I've played both ways. Objectively, I think knight f6 is a better, sounder way to play. But if your style or your mood is a little bit more aggressive, then putting the knight on e7 is perfectly viable. And I've tested this variation in probably the majority of my games. I think that I've actually castled long more than I've castled short here. And the knight on e7 has a lot of other benefits other than just simply freeing up the f6 square for the pawn. The idea here is that once I play f6 g5, I'm actually weakening this f5 square, which could be very often exploited. So the knight on e7 is adding some extra protection to my structure. And another reason is that another benefit of the knight on e7 is in some positions I can even play the move knight to c6, also adding some protection to my king side and to my knight. So I want to show you guys this game that I played after playing knight e7 and involving this plan of castling long. Now my opponent played this move, bishop to a4, and again, I must admit this is also an idea that I've faced on multiple occasions, getting rid of this light square bishop for white and black, and well, we have to be okay with that, so I just played castle long as part of the plan, and now my opponent took on d7 and queen takes d7. So the battle lines are drawn. Both sides have castled on opposite sides. White castled short, I've castled long. And as I mentioned, I have this plan of shoving my pawns down the board. Of course, white should also try to generate some sort of attack on the queen side. Of course, opposite side castling positions dictate that. So in this position, my opponent played knight d2, so getting his pieces out. And now I decided that, okay, this knight on e5 is well defended, so there may not be a need to play f6. So I snuck in a move and played the move rook. I snuck a move in, rook hg8, trying to cheat a little bit, trying to play without this f6 move, and getting ready to play g5. Now, I think this is a very easy to play position, and I like black's chances here because this move g5 is coming with a tempo followed by g4, trying to exploit this pawn. And white still has to worry about this diagonal here on this weak king. So already I think black is for preference. I have a strong 10 bias towards black here. And just to back it up, I want to show you guys how this game went. b4 was played by white, so trying to perhaps fight for some squares, trying to maybe push these pawns down the board. However, our plan is very simple. g5, getting a hit on the bishop. Bishop e3, very logically sort of covering this diagonal. Now king b8. And in fact, I think that this pawn push on the queen side that white has attempted here has actually backfired, because in this case now this c4 pawn is the c4 square is an outpost, and after rook c8 this pawn on c3 is backwards, so it's not really clear where white's attack is. Meanwhile, black has pretty decent chances to get something rolling here, as we'll see, and white is just creating weaknesses. So now white played knight b3, trying to slide the knight to c5, but now he's weak in control of c4, so the knight goes to c4. I've mentioned this is a common idea, putting the knight to c4 so we can target this weak e3 square. And now my opponent played bishop to c5. I played bishop e5, deciding to keep this bishop on the board since it's pretty strong in the center, attacking both king side and queen side. And now after bishop e5, queen d3, queen to c7, I'm trying to provoke a weakness on the queen side here. If h3, then of course these dark squares are tremendously weak, and h5, g4 is just going to be very powerful, blowing open the position using white's hooks. And if g3, then there's going to be h5, trying to also take advantage of the hooks in black's position. So, in white's position rather. So here white after queen c7 played this move bishop to e7, which I don't really like, but it's tough to suggest a decent idea for white here. And now after queen takes e7, white played knight c5, so this was the idea. He wants to free up the square. And now after queen c7, g3, h5, I think black is very much for choice here. There's no stopping h4. This king side is tremendously weak. Meanwhile, black has this extremely powerful bishop in the center. This knight at c4 is no joke. The d5 isolated pawn is in fact clearly a strength to black's position. And in this opposite side castling position, white really has no attack going. So another viable plan, putting this knight to e7. Like I said, the critical choice for me came in this position here. No, not quite this one. The position after castles, bishop b6, bishop c2. And knight f6 is something we've discussed, going short and bringing the rooks to the center. But knight e7 is another very fine option that I've used with great success, aiming to go long and then throwing these pawns down the board. So going back to the original position, the original starting position of the exchange Caro-Kann here. So after queen c7, we looked at the main move of knight e2. But I believe this move, although the main line, although very popular, I believe this is a variation that black should warmly welcome, as the resulting positions with the dark square weaknesses are very easy to play and easy to exploit, and I've always had strong results in practice, and I think armed with this knowledge, the same will be for you. So instead, in this position, I'd like to deal with some of white's alternatives, and these are very, very important. As I've spoke about in the introduction, The pawn structure that is reached in this, after white takes here and plays c3, this pawn structure is known as the Carlsbad structure, and we discussed what white's plans are. White should be trying to play on the king side here. Black may be trying to play on the queen side. I'm going to show you several variations where these themes are going to be very important, where we're going to see some very important examples of black's play on the queen side, notably the minority attack. And we're also going to look at some of white's other options. Now, the other options white may play here are, there's a lot of moves they can try, but in my experience, they haven't been played quite often. But if the alternatives to knight e2 combined have been played as often as knight e2. However, the good news is that there's no real need to memorize a different variation for different white attempt after queen c7. For example, the moves that we will have a passing glance at are primarily bishop g5, knight f3, and h3. What these moves actually have in common is that they lead to the same types of positions where black can follow the same plan. So that's why what I'm about to show you involving the queenside play is very important, because against knight e2 we have our variation with bishop g4 and then play for dark squares, as we've seen, and for everything else we're going to learn this Carlsbad pawn structure. So the most harmless move white can try here is the move knight f3, which will simply allow us to play bishop g4 and get this pin on the knight. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at this position because we're actually going to transpose into it in several variations. But black's setup here, as an introduction, is after castles we will play e6, the bishop will come to d6, the knight will come to f6, and following castling, black will be perfectly alright. We're going to go into this position a little bit more detail via transposition, where white plays the move bishop to g5. And I will also write a little bit about this position in the attached PGNs for you to go over. However, if we just examine this move bishop g5 and examine this excerpt of a game that I've selected, we will come to grips with black's plans quite easily. So this move bishop g5 looks a little weird, but I've faced it on several occasions, notably from several master opponents. And the idea of this move is that white sees that he can't go bishop to f4, so he chooses the next best square, g5. And at first sight, it looks like this is a pretty annoying move to deal with, because our normal development of knight f6 may lead to the doubling of our pawns, which could maybe not be welcome. And on the other hand, white is actually planning to play bishop h4 and bishop g3. So this looks like maybe a slightly creative, maybe way to pose black problems, but in fact, if black just knows one key idea here, he will be perfectly alright. And that is actually to play knight f6. And the whole point of this move is that actually we're not worried at all about this move bishop takes f6, because after g takes f6, it's sort of like the position we examined, or that I've spoken about, that where black plays g6, bishop f5 and gets double pawns. These double pawns here provide a lot of benefits to black. First of all, this open g-file can prove to be quite useful, but even a greater advantage is that black has two bishops and is already threatening to go e5, and this strike in the center is going to be very, very unpleasant for white to deal with, because it will open up the position for black's bishops, and the king can of course always go long. So bishop takes f6 here is not a viable option. Therefore, the move that has been played most often here is the move knight to f3, and now black can play bishop g4, knight d2, and e6. So this is a setup that we've already briefly discussed in a slightly different context. White in this game played bishop h4, and we are now following a game played by a former world champion, Viswanathan Anand, and it was very exemplary how he handled the black pieces here. We will go through a few more moves of this game just to get a sense of how black should be setting up here. After bishop h4, black plays bishop d6, and we've already sort of seen this setup with bishop d6, knight f6. Black is just getting his pieces to good squares, preparing to get castled, and then we will see how to play on the queen side with this minority attack. Bishop g3 was played in this game, and now a very, very important plan for black that's worth noting. Anand plays bishop to h5, and copying white, he's retreating his bishop back to g6, in order to nullify the pressure against his kingside and exchange his powerful bishop that is exerting pressure on both sides of the board. So after bishop takes h5, already black is completely fine. Bishop d6, queen d6, and this is a type of position that I've reached multiple times in my chess career, and it's perfectly harmless. After castles, rook e1, we will go through a few more moves just to get a feel of how black should be playing here and how to take over the initiative. Now after rook e1, Anand still hasn't played bishop g6 because it's not really running away. He's enjoying this pin, and instead plays the move rook a to b8. And already I'm actually thinking black is slightly for choice here. Probably the position is equal, but it's really clear what black should be doing here. Playing this move b5 and then b4, trying to soften up white's queenside pawns. So I'm going to attach the rest of this game in the PGN with a little bit more comments. But for now, suffice to say that this setup here, whether white plays bishop g5 or whether white plays knight f3 allowing bishop g4, this setup here that what black should adopt is knight f6, bishop g4, e6, bishop d6, and of course another nice plan here that Anand used was bishop to h5, aiming to trade off this powerful bishop and also provide defense to the king side, followed by starting minority attack on the queen side. Now we're going to look at another game here, and this is the game that's really going to help us understand the queenside play and the strength of the minority attack. And I consider the variation here to be more challenging than the ones that we've just looked at. So going back here to our first move where we get the exchange Kann, c3, queen c7, we've mentioned the move bishop to g5 and knight f3, and these moves sort of transpose into one another provided black plays the same moves. And a much more challenging move that I've faced only a couple times in my career, really, quite a rare move, is the move h3. And this is a pretty deep idea here. White is playing against this light square bishop, sort of copying black. Black is playing against a dark square bishop, trying to hinder his development, and white is saying, alright, I'll do the same thing, so I'm taking away both of these squares. Now, the reason white plays h3 here is he's aiming to simply develop this knight to f3 and not allow the pin with bishop to g4. So, in this position, we're going to have to change plans slightly. So, first we will play knight f6 like everything is normal. White plays the move knight f3. And now, to develop this bishop, we're going to borrow an idea that I showed in the previous chapter, the quick, easy-to-learn Kann method. We're actually going to adopt that method here and play the move g6. And now we're actually trying to get this bishop out via f5. By the way, before we move on, I should mention a rare idea that I've used once that I believe is interesting, is against h3, play the move e5, striking in the center immediately. And the idea here is to play with this isolated pawn. Now the position is a little bit similar to the one we've examined with the pawn in f3. Of course, the pawn in h3 provides a better version for white, as he hasn't weakened the dark squares. But I think this is a very reasonable way for black to play. Again, the ideas are similar here, with the pieces coming out potentially bishop e6, knight e7, or even the more aggressive knight f6, knight e4 idea. So this is quite a rare line that I think is acceptable, but I'm also perfectly satisfied with the idea of playing g6, which we will now take a longer look at. So again, the idea of g6 is obviously to play bishop f5 and get this bishop out. And now actually in this version, black is actually very happy. White plays castles, and black can play bishop f5, and black would be more than happy if white captures the bishop, allowing pawn takes, because now the king hasn't castled short yet, so there's a very real chance the king will bolt long, and then after rook g8 there may be some serious attacking chances, especially since white has played h3, providing some weaknesses around his king. So white usually, actually almost never, takes this bishop on f5, and instead allows black, after rook e1, to trade this bishop off. And now we're going to follow one of my games, a pretty old game that I've played, 5 years old now actually. And this game goes along pretty normal channels, and I believe it's a very instructive game in order to understand how black can sort of outplay white here in these dryish looking, more quiet positions, not with a g-file attack, but rather with this minority attack that we've been alluding to. So in this game, I played the move bishop to g7, so I'm still actually trying to get white to capture an f5, so I can get this attack. White played knight a3. I played the move a6, stopping any knight to b5 ideas, and now white played knight a2. So a little bit of a non-standard maneuver, perhaps, moving this knight around, but looks reasonable. Now I finally decided, alright, it's time to capture, and castle short. So this is the type of position that we've sort of looked at and sort of not looked at the same time. We've looked at plans of playing bishop to f5. We've also looked at plans of starting a minority attack, but not quite together and in this hybrid. And the reason that I'm showing this game is because, as I mentioned already, we're really going to understand how this minority attack comes to take shape. So in this game, white plays knight e5, which is one of the main plans to occupy the center. But this fianchetto structure here means that my king is going to be quite safe, so I'm not really worried about any attacks. Played pawn to e6 to add extra protection to the center. Bishop f4 was played. I snapped the knight off. Bishop takes e5 was played. Now I played the move queen c6, allowing knight to b4, and now dropping back to c8. So I guess my reasoning was that I thought the knight would want to go to e3, so I was more than happy to lure it to b4. I'm not so sure this reasoning was correct, since the knight can come back to d3, but alright, we will have an examination of the game regardless. So white plays queen f3, which is a good move, preparing to go knight d3, and also attacking this knight here. Knight d7 was played, bishop takes g7, king takes g7. So, again, the position is sort of looking like a little dry, a little boring, but it's important, once again, to see what plan black can take here in order to generate positive chances. Knight to d3, and now b5. So grabbing some space on the queen side and alluding to a further push of a5 and b4. Queen g3 was played, queen to b7, queen d6. White is trying to get some initiative to attack these dark squares. Rook d8 was played, now knight c5. Knight takes c5, queen c5, and rook c8, queen a3. So, over the past couple of moves, admittedly, white has not played the best possible chess. He has sort of maneuvered his queen from a really reasonable post on f3/g3 to a little bit of an unreasonable post on a3. He has also traded off his knight, which I believe was a pretty nice piece, as it had good prospects on e5 or c5. And now he is in this position where we only have, of course, equal material, just down to the heavy pieces. And I should also mention that at the time, my opponent is 2100, an expert, and at the time I was 2300, so I had a rating advantage. So certainly my opponent may have been playing this way as he was influenced by the rating difference, perhaps trying to go for a draw. Well, in this position, I have to prove that that there are positive chances, and already I've mentioned that I want to play a5 b4. And the way I started that is playing the move rook to c4, getting my rook in a nice central spot, preparing this move b4. He plays queen to b3, and the idea is after b4 my queen will be pinned, so no rush here. Queen c7, a3, and now a5, using some tactics here. The idea is if white captures b5 after rook b8, well, first of all, this queen is almost strapped. It has to go to a6, and after the simple rook b2, white is just losing a pawn since he has a weakness on c3. So this is the whole point of the minority attack, actually, to create weaknesses in this structure. After the superior rook e3, b4 was played regardless, and pawn takes, rook to a4. Now, rook b8, queen d1 was played, and to fast forward a little bit after rook c8, rook captures, pawn captures, black is well on his way of achieving this goal. In fact, it's almost fully successful. For the moment, black is a pawn down, but white is straddled with 3 weak isolated pawns that are extremely easy to target. Meanwhile, black only has 1 very solid pawn island, and white has to worry about all of these weaknesses. So queen d6 was played. White now played queen d2, rook to c4, And already getting hard to hold all of these pawns. Rook d3, queen b6, b3, rook takes b4. And this is a position that I've reached, not this exact one, of course, but this type of position I've had the opportunity to play many times over the years, primarily against lower-rated players who sort of get into these types of positions thinking that the draw here will be quite easy to make with the reduced material. But actually, as we will see how this game progresses, this is a position that I do not mind at all playing with black, targeting two weaknesses simultaneously, and we can see that white's pieces are severely tied down. So I would like to actually go through this whole game in its entirety, and we'll take it to the finish to show how to win this type of position. And also, this can be a lesson not just for the opening. Of course, we're well past the opening at this point at move 36. We're in an endgame now. But I believe this studying this game is also would be helpful to your chess in general. Oftentimes, we reach endgames that are of this matter here. Objectively speaking, this position is probably drawn. White should be able to muster enough defenses. So the question is, if we reach these types of positions where we're better, but it's a draw, how do we convert them into wins? Well, this game and what happens next, I hope to show you methods that I use and methods that, of course, many masters and grandmasters and international masters have used. And that method is you have to continue seeking out more and more tiny concessions from your opponent, continue prodding, continue posing problems, continue just playing the position on and on and on and on, tiring your opponent out, having them slowly make some mistakes. And in this position, I played the move h5, which is, I really like this move because it's hard to improve my position, so I just gain some space. And my next move, if white's going to let me, is to play the move h4, locking down this pawn chain. What happens next? Then I'll find another way to improve my position. So white plays this move g3. He's preventing h4. Now I play queen b8, giving myself some breathing room. King g2, rook b7, so preparing a potential infiltration. Queen b2 was played. And now I played the move h4. Again, probing, probing, probing. Now, of course, if white wants to take, now he has to, his king is severely compromised. After either queen f4 or maybe even queen h8, I will regain the pawn. So white here decided to play queen c3, and now after pawn takes g3, pawn takes g3, now this king is a little bit more open, with the second rank being more vulnerable. And I also have potentially some ideas of playing in the center down the line. So again, small concessions, small adjustments to the position. And now play the move rook c7, queen to b2, and now queen b4. And already it's getting tough to defend white's position, as queen e1 is a threat, and we see that white's pieces are just stuck defending these weak pawns. After queen e2, rook to c1, queen e5 check, king g8, white is actually really starting to feel the pain of this back rank, and also the possible ideas of rook c2 and then an invasion via c1 or a1, and it's getting very difficult to defend here. Now, my opponent was unable to defend this position after rook to e3, rook c2 check. He found nothing better than to play rook e2, as otherwise I would be able to play queen d2. And after rook e2 captures queen d4, I had won a pawn and went on to win the game. I will attach the full game in the PGN, of course, with some comments, but for our purposes, we can stop here. Black has reached quite a successful position. So let's go back in this game. As I mentioned, this game showcases the power of the minority attack, and really the key position starts from here, where white has gone into this situation on his own accord. Again, rook c4, and then queen b3, queen c7. Black's whole plan here is just to support this pawn advance, and the whole reason this pawn advance is so successful and so effective is that we are creating weaknesses in white's camp. Now, for example, in this position, let's say white plays a move like, for example, rook c1. Oh, rook c1 is not a very good move because of rook takes d4 even. But let's say we reach a position like this, then white is really going to be struggling here defending the weakness on c3 and the weakness on a3. Whereas what happened in the game, now white has to deal with constantly this weak pawn on c3, and when he did trade on d4 and eventually lost his b4 pawn, he had to deal with two weaknesses on the b and d file, and eventually, not surprisingly, ended up losing this pawn on d4. I also mentioned how to play positions where you are on the better side of a draw, so to speak, although I would say this position is it doesn't really qualify for that. I really think black has decent winning chances here, more than decent, I should say. And the secret is, well, you just have to keep playing, posing problems to your opponent. This move h5, I believe, is a very good example of that, just gaining space. And in fact, this move h5 really did lead me to win the game after this further move h4, trying to create more weaknesses in the opponent's position. And the weakness that was created here was the weakness of the king. And then I succeeded in infiltrating and winning the game. Another thing I should actually mention, it's also psychological. In this exact position, I may not really have a concrete plan going on here. Well, I probably want to play rook b1 here and then go after this pawn. But a lot of times in these positions, even when I play h4, for example, the position here is, I don't think white is in trouble here, but from a psychological point of view, the pressure really is on white when you are the one, when black is playing moves like h5, h4, attacking the position, forcing white to make decisions. Does he play g4? Does he take the pawn? Does he let this pawn structure stay? And I think this truly led to the victory in this game. So let us recap this chapter on the exchange Caro-Kann with variation Queen c7. We looked at knight e2 here, and after bishop g4, f3, bishop d7, bishop f4, e5, captures. Okay, we already have our arrows here from before, but the point here is black gets very nice play on the dark squares. You have a choice of castling queenside or kingside depending on your mood or style. I'm going to preface this again by saying I believe castling kingside is objectively stronger, but castling queenside is also possible. And then the other important types of positions we reached here were either after the sort of meek knight f3, which leads to very simple development for black, following bishop d6 and knight f6 and then dropping the bishop back. And this is also true after bishop g5, for example. And a more critical line is the line with h3, where I implore you to remember this idea with g6 and then getting the bishop out via f5. And once again, do not forget this plan of playing on the queen side with a minority attack, trying to create weaknesses in your opponent's camp and exploiting them. So pretty interesting chapter, in my opinion, where the game at points can be quite tactical, as in the variations with knight e2, but also can be quite positional in the variations where we have the minority attack, such as this case. So once again, a pretty universal weapon we can find ourselves in when we play the Caro-Kann, and I'm wishing you a lot of success in this variation. I've given you multiple weapons here to your liking, and of course please check the PGNs attached with this DVD to go over these variations and read about, to witness some further examples of everything.
மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.